When marimba rhythms start to play, dance with me, make me sway. Like a lazy ocean hugs the shore, hold me close, sway me more. Like a flower bending in the breeze, bend with me, sway with ease. When we dance you have a way with me, stay with me, sway with me. You guys are a bit of a tough crowd, but let's get down to it. This is a jazz history lesson and the importance on the Great Gatsby. There's 4 elements in this video: the history of jazz, a little bit of history of music, why jazz was important to the book, and why jazz was important to the time. Jazz music, like all music, originated somewhere. And from the first moment humans set foot on this earth, there has been music in all cultures. We can trace back the history of jazz to the very beginning, when slaves started coming over to the colonies back in the 1550s and 1560s. The first slaves to arrive in the British American colonies were brought to Virginia in 1607. Now, the slaves coming over worked harsh hours in the plantation, typically working on corn, tobacco, and other crops on the plantation. In the harsh hours, they'd keep themselves busy by singing songs, hymns, and spirituals. Now, all of these are just one component of jazz. The other being, with all the immigrants coming in, and this may sound familiar to you, the Creoles of the time had to find work. With all the immigrants taking up space, some of them would become street musicians. Now, jazz was born through the components of the hymns and spirituals from the plantation, the European background, and a little bit of stuff they picked up here in the Americas. Now, move time up to around the 1860s, you have some of your more famous jazz musicians, or the early ones, in fact, like Scott Joplin, Buddy Bolden, King Oliver. Now, Scott Joplin is famous and is considered the foremost composer of ragtime music, where his music was based on European classical music and led to the development of the style known as stride piano, and one of the first forms of jazz. Now, it originated amongst African Americans in New Orleans in about the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It developed its roots from all listed above, plus blues and ragtime, and since the 1920s, jazz has been recognized as a major form of musical expression. Now that we've reached the 1920s, we can get in time with the Great Gatsby. Now, jazz is recognized around the world for its rich cultural heritage and African American experience, and this is a big deal, for when jazz came around, it had its fair share of influence on all other types of music at the time. Despite having all its advantages, jazz did have a small hatred towards it. Whites were still racist. This wasn't a big thing, but despite everything else, jazz brought people together, especially in the 1920s, when you had your famous clubs like the Cotton Club or even the Blue Notes. But now that we've gotten to the 1920s, let's talk a little bit about the Great Gatsby. Some of the only mentions of jazz in the time were the Chic of Araby, Ain't We Got Fun, and 3 o'clock in the morning. 3 o'clock in the morning because you have your threes, little symbolism there. But one of the biggest mentions of jazz and a little play that Scott was having was when the band leader refers to the sensation of Carnegie Hall, Vladimir Tostov's Jazz History of the World. And what's interesting about this is everyone's having a little fun, laughing about Vladimir and how he's so proud to have his own history when everyone there knows that the history of jazz is bigger than him. People knew that jazz was a big thing. When you see Gatsby taking Nick into the city and you look over to the other car and it's the white man driving the Negroes, things were changing. It wasn't just a white man's world anymore. All of Tom's slur at white supremacy. A cool thing about the time was jazz was changing everything, including the social norms. So now that you've seen everything about jazz and what it did for the time, it's up to you to see everything you've done, looked at, or heard from music. Think to yourself, how much of that was influenced by jazz? Because just because you don't listen to jazz in everyday music doesn't mean it's affected your life or affected the things you've listened to. Thank you.